Good evening, my dear listener, and welcome back to the quiet hour, the hour when the lamps are turned low and the world outside forgets to trouble us for a little while. Tonight, I have a story for you that comes from an old, cold house at the edge of a town whose name has been worn away by time and by telling. A house that stood with its shoulders hunched against the wind, as though it too were waiting for someone to come home. Settle yourself now. Let your blankets grow heavy around you, and let your breath slow to the pace of a house settling for the night. And I shall begin. There once lived in that house a painter by the name of Roderick Vane, a man whose hair had gone the colour of ash and whose hands, though still steady with a brush, had grown too accustomed to solitude to remember what it was to reach for anyone at all. He had not always been alone. Once the house had rung with voices, with the clatter of a family at supper and the small disasters of children who tracked mud across good floors. But the years had taken those voices from him one by one, gently at times and cruelly at others, until only Roderick remained, moving from room to room like a man counting the furniture of a life that had already ended, though his own had not yet caught up to the fact. He painted still, out of habit more than hope, filling canvas after canvas with studies of the one thing he found he could no longer bear to be without, which was coziness, though he would not have named it so himself. He painted fires in grates that had gone cold decades before, fires so carefully rendered that visitors who did not know better would lean towards them, half expecting to feel heat upon their faces, and finding instead only the chill of an unheated room and the faint smell of linseed oil and dust. It was on a grey evening in the last week of October, with the wind doing its slow work at the windows and the first true cold of the year settling into the bones of the house, that a parcel arrived for Roderick, sent by a solicitor's clerk on behalf of an aunt he had met perhaps 3 times in his life and had not thought of in 20 years. Inside the parcel, wrapped in yellowing paper and tied with a ribbon gone the colour of weak tea, was a mirror. It was not, on first inspection, a remarkable object. Its frame was tarnished silver, worked into a pattern of ivy leaves that had lost their crispness to age, and its glass had the faint, swimming darkness that old mirrors take on, as though the silvering beneath had begun, very slowly, to dream. A letter came with it, written in a hand so frail it seemed to tremble even on the page, and it said only this: that the mirror had come down through the women of the family for longer than anyone could account for, that it was known, in whispers rather than in any book, to show not what stood before it, but what the heart most wished to see, and that it should be hung, if Roderick were willing, somewhere he would pass it often, and never, under any circumstance, be shown to a stranger who had not first been trusted with its nature. Roderick, who did not believe in magic any more than he believed in miracles, read the letter twice, smiled the small, tired smile of a man humouring a dead woman's fancy, and hung the mirror on the wall where his easel had stood for 30 years. In the bare, high-ceilinged room he still called his studio, though he had painted little of worth in it for a long while. He hung it, and thought no more of it, and went to bed early, as was his habit, with the cold already settling into the room like a guest who meant to stay. It was the following evening that he first noticed the fire. He had gone into the studio at dusk, meaning only to fetch a cloth he had left there, and the room was, as it always was at that hour, blue with the coming dark and cold enough that his breath showed faintly before him. He glanced as he passed at the mirror on the wall and stopped, because within its dark glass, where his own grey reflection ought to have stood alone, there burned a fire. It was not a reflection of any fire in the room, for there was none. The grate beneath the mirror had stood empty and swept for years. Yet there it was, flames climbing gold and orange within the glass, throwing a soft and moving light across the reflected walls of a room that was and was not his own. And as he stood there, astonished into stillness, he became aware, slowly, that he could feel it. A gentle heat, faint but unmistakable, reaching out from the glass and touching his face and his outstretched hands, the way a real fire touches a man who has come in from the cold. He stood before it a long while that first evening, saying nothing, for there was no one to say it to, only holding his hands towards the glass as the light moved and settled and the heat spread slowly through the room, until the old ache that had lived in his chest for years, an ache he had stopped noticing the way one stops noticing an old scar, eased, just slightly, for the first time in longer than he could remember. He did not tell himself it was magic. He told himself that night, and for several nights after, that it was some trick of the failing light, some fault of his eyes grown tired with age and too much staring at canvas. And he went to bed each night, resolving to have the mirror looked at by someone who understood. Old glass. But each evening he found his feet carrying him back to the studio at dusk, and each evening the fire was there, waiting, and each evening the heat reached him a little sooner, as though the glass had begun, in its slow and patient way, to know him. It was on the 7th evening, when the wind had turned bitter and the first frost had silvered the fields beyond the house, that Roderick understood what the letter had meant, though he had not consciously wished for anything at all. He had only stood before the glass, as was now his habit, his thoughts on nothing more than the cold in his hands, and the long quiet of the house around him, and the fire had come, as it always came, and he had realised, watching it, that what he had wished for, without knowing he wished it, was simply not to be cold. Not the house, not himself. Just for 1 hour of one evening to be warm. After that, he began to test it, cautiously, the way a man tests a floorboard he suspects will not hold his weight. He stood before the mirror one evening and let himself think, deliberately, of the garden as it had been in the years when there had been someone to tend it. Full and green and heavy with roses that his late wife had planted with her own hands along the south wall. Roses he had let go to briar and ruin in his grief, because he could not bear to look at them, and could not bear to cut them down either. He thought of that garden, and watched, and the fire in the glass did not vanish, but around it, at the edges of the reflected room, there crept, slowly, the suggestion of green, of climbing stems, and small white flowers opening in a light that was neither candlelight nor dawn, until the whole reflected room seemed to stand at the edge of a garden that no longer existed anywhere but in his memory. And now, it seemed, in the glass. He wept then, for the first time in years, not from grief, but from a feeling closer to relief. The relief of a man who has carried a weight so long he has forgotten it is a weight, and who is permitted, for one moment, to set it down. From that evening forward, the mirror became the still centre of his days. He did not use it lightly, nor often, sensing somehow, without being told, that it was not a toy to be worn thin with careless wishing. He came to it perhaps twice in a week, at dusk, when the light was soft and the house was at its quietest, and each time he brought it a single small wish, never grand, never greedy, only the aching private things that a lonely man carries without ever fully naming them aloud. He wished, one evening, for the dog he had kept as a young man, a patient old collie named Bramble, who had slept by his chair through a decade of winters, and the mirror gave him, for the length of one long breath, the weight of a warm head upon his knee, and the soft, familiar sound of a dog, dreaming by a fire. He wished that another evening, for his daughter's laugh, and though the room stayed dim, and no figure appeared, he heard it, faint and clear as a bell, struck once in a distant room, and sat afterward with his face in his hands, smiling despite the tears that came with it. The village, in its slow way, began to notice that the painter had changed. He was seen at the baker's of a morning with an unaccustomed colour in his face, and he had taken, the older women observed with some suspicion, to humming as he walked, an old air none of them could place. They did not know, of course, of the mirror, for Roderick kept his aunt's warning close, and showed the glass to no one. But they knew a man returning to himself when they saw one, however strange the manner of his return. Winter deepened, and Roderick's visits to the glass grew, if not more frequent, then more considered, as though he sensed that this arrangement, however gentle, however kind, would not go on forever, and that it ought to be treated as the rare and precious thing it was, rather than worn away through careless use. He began, too, to notice a change he had not noticed at first. That after each wish was granted, the mirror seemed, for a night or two afterward, dimmer than before, its glass a shade darker, its silvering a little more tired, as though the granting of each small comfort cost the old thing more than it could easily spare. He resolved, seeing this, to ask for nothing more, to let the mirror rest, and for a fortnight he kept his word, walking past the studio each evening without pausing, though it cost him a good deal to do it, for the comfort of those small wishes had become, in its way, as necessary to him as bread. It was on the last evening of that fortnight, the night before the old year turned, that the mirror called to him, though not in any voice he could have named. He felt it rather than heard it, a pull at the edge of his thoughts as he sat by his cold and empty hearth, a sense that the house itself wished, gently, to speak with him one final time. He went to the studio, as he had not allowed himself to go in 14 days, and found the glass darker than he had ever seen it, its ivy frame tarnished nearly black, as though the mirror itself had grown old before him in the span of a fortnight. The way its former keepers, whoever they had been, must once have watched it age in their turn. He understood, standing there, that this would be the last wish the glass would grant him, not because any voice told him so, but because he felt it in the same sure, unhurried way he had felt the truth of every wish before it. And he understood, too, that he had been holding back, without knowing it, some final and larger longing he had never let himself look at directly, for fear that even a mirror as strange and kind as this one could not possibly grant it. He stood before the glass a long while in the cold blue dusk of the year's last evening, and let himself, at last, think of it fully. Not the fire, not the garden, not the dog or the laugh, but the whole of it together. The house as it had been when it was full. His wife at the window with the last light on her hair. His daughter's small shoes by the door. The sound of a family moving through rooms that had been, for one brief span of years, entirely alive. He did not ask for them to return, for even in his longing he knew what could and could not be undone. And so instead, as the fire began to rise in the glass, warmer and larger than it had ever risen before, he found himself asking only this: that he might, for 1 hour, be allowed to sit among them again, not as a ghost among the living, nor the living among ghosts, but simply as a man who is finally permitted to say goodbye properly to what he loved. And the glass answered him. The fire rose, gold and vast, filling the whole of the mirror's dark surface, and within its light, faint at first and then steady as candle flame, steadying in a closed room, the studio behind him seemed to fill, reflected in the glass, with firelight and furniture he had long since sold or given away, with the low murmur of voices he had not heard in a decade, with shapes that gathered slowly around a hearth that blazed as his own. True hearth had not blazed in 20 years. He did not turn to look behind him, sensing somehow that what was given only to the glass, only to be witnessed rather than touched. And he sat down, there on the cold studio floor before the mirror, and let himself watch his family gather one final time in the golden light. Let himself hear, faintly, the familiar music of a house that is fully, wholly alive. He stayed there the whole of that hour, and if he wept, it was the good kind of weeping, the kind that empties a wound of the poison it has carried too long, and when at last the fire in the glass began, gently to fade, he did not reach for it, did not beg it to stay. For he understood, with a peace he had not known himself capable of, that this was not an ending stolen from him, but a farewell given freely, the last and greatest kindness of a strange old mirror that had asked nothing of him but honesty. When the glass had gone dark and quiet at last, its ivy frame settled into an ordinary, tarnished stillness, Roderick rose from the cold floor, his knees aching in the way of an old man's knees, and found that the ache in his chest, the one he had carried so long he had ceased to notice its weight, had gone quiet too, not vanished. For some griefs do not vanish, but settled, the way a house settles after a long storm, into a shape that could, at last, be lived with. He hung a small cloth over the mirror's frame that night, not from fear, but from a kind of tenderness, the way one might draw a blanket over a sleeping creature that has given all it has to give, and he left it that way through the whole of the winter that followed, though he did not put it away, for he found, in the months that came after, that he no longer needed it to feel. The house was not entirely empty. He returned instead to his canvases and painted, that spring, not fires in cold and empty grates, but a garden in full bloom along a south-facing wall, and a hearth with 3 small shapes gathered before it, indistinct, golden, warm, hung in his studio, not as a wish any longer, but as a memory he had finally been permitted to keep. And if, in the years that followed, the people of the village noticed that old Roderick Vane kept a covered mirror in his studio that he would neither sell nor explain, they thought it only the harmless eccentricity of a painter grown old and a little strange in his solitude, and never guessed that behind that plain grey cloth there hung the last, kind gift of a mirror that had given a lonely man his peace back. One small wish at a time, and asked, in the end, for nothing but to be allowed one true and golden fire before it rested. And so the house grew quiet again, as houses do, and the frost came and went upon the windows, and Roderick Vane slept in the years that were left to him more easily than he had in a very long while. And perhaps, my dear listener, that is where we too shall leave him, in that quiet, settled house, with the covered glass upon the wall and the garden painted fresh upon the canvas, and let ourselves drift now towards our own quiet hour, our own gentle dark, carrying with us, if we wish, some small and private comfort of our own. Sleep well. Good night.